All right, good morning, everybody. Well, afternoon. It's still morning. 10 more minutes of morning. Thank you guys for all being here for the lunch and for coming here to listen. This is Dr. Sara Mckinnon. I'll let her give you her official title. She's a professor at the University of Wisconsin, Madison here. And let's give her a warm welcome as she talks to us today about the U.S. asylum system today.
I want to give a special shout out to Jing, who invited me to come to speak with you today. So as Mike mentioned, I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Department of Communication Arts, and I'm currently the faculty director of Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies. My research for the past 2 decades has been about U.S. refugee and asylum systems. I wrote a book many years ago now about the incorporation of gender-based protections and protections on the basis of sexuality for individuals who came to the United States fleeing persecution in their home countries. From that research, I've also served as an expert witness in many asylum seekers' cases. I work right now a lot in Latin America on questions of immigration and refugee policy. And so what I want to do today is to talk about the U.S. asylum system. I'm going to first contextualize and historicize this system, and then I want to bring us to where we are right now, post-2025. So much has changed about protections for immigrants and refugees, certainly in the United States, also around the world. Today I'm going to focus on the U.S. I think it's really relevant to understand what's happening in our communities. If you want to know about the work that I do in Latin America, I can come back another day and I can talk about that. Just like too hard to fit everything into one presentation. All right, so just to get a bit of background, when we think about the U.S. refugee and asylum program, we have to track back to World War II and the human rights protections from the international community that emerged from that framework. So the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights articulates 2 articles that really focus on people's right to move in contexts of persecution and people's right to seek asylum, to seek refuge in contexts of persecution. Now, you'll note that these articles are Article 13 and Article 14. So Article 13 says that everyone has the right to move, and Article 14 says that everyone has the right to seek and enjoy asylum. What these articles do not state is that everyone has the right to receive asylum. Really, when we think about the system of managing who gets to be a refugee, who gets to receive asylum in the countries, the universal community really placed that emphasis on nations, nation states, to do the system of administering that right. So this means, if we think, the many decades later from 1948 until now, this means that there are drastically different approaches to receiving refugees around the world. Again, I'm going to focus on the United States, but it's always helpful to have these articles in mind, that these are things that are endowed through this framework. Oh yeah, did you click here? Maybe. Mike, I might need your help with this. Awesome. In the United States, we use a definition of a refugee that is quite old. It's the 1951 United Nations definition, and it states that a refugee is a person who is outside of their home country, who has a well-founded fear of persecution on the basis of, and there are 5 categories, these are very important categories, on the basis of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a social group. These 5 categories become really significant as we think about who can be recognized in the United States as a refugee today. We still use this definition. Now, in other countries, this is a definition that's largely based in what was happening post-World War II. Other countries recognize, wow, contexts of violence, contexts of persecution have changed a good bit over the decades. Not in the United States. We still use this definition. And so as you think about who can receive refugee status in the US, we always have to track back to this definition. I'll have you go to the next one. I think it's also important to recognize that a refugee or an asylum seeker, this is a very limited category of migration, of movement, human movement, whereas the reality is that there are many shapes and forms to movement and migration today. There are many ways in which individuals move across nation-state borders. Some are international students, some move for family reasons, some move for work-related reasons. This slide and me saying that there are different reasons, there are different categories, makes it sound like it's really neat and simple. The reality is that it's not at all neat and simple. The majority of people who move across nation-state borders will also move across these categories, sometimes 2, 3, 4 times over the course of their lifetime. And so I really like to always think about the blurry lines between these categories that oftentimes, when we think about the categories, we have to understand that they're politicized constructs. I think of them in some ways more as means to exclude than to include, right? Because of how clearly defined, how rigidly defined sometimes these categories are. This is just context to always remind ourselves that we traverse these boundaries over the course of our lifetime. That's really common. All right, next slide. Okay, so in the US, if we think about the system we have for receiving refugees, we have to go back to the 1980 Refugee Act. This is an important piece of legislation that set in motion and really established 2 systems for receiving refugees in the United States. The US is, in some ways, a unique country in terms of how we receive refugees because we have 2 systems, and we also have one system that involves courts, which is strange. That's not the way many countries do it. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So the two frameworks, or the 2 systems, are asylum seekers, and the second one is refugee resettlement. The major difference between these 2 structures, the 2 systems that the US has, is that people who come to the US as resettled refugees apply outside of the United States. So their whole processing happens outside of the United States. Like if you think about individuals from communities like the Sudan, like Somalia, many times these were individuals who were living in refugee camps for many years, for decades. They first were recognized by the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, as refugees there. So they received that recognition there. And then later on, over lots of years of deliberation, Congress, in conversation with volunteer agencies and many other individuals, say, this is a community that needs a permanent home. There is no end in sight to the conflict in their home country, and so let's think about refugee resettlement. So that's refugee resettlement. Asylum means when someone arrives at or within the borders of the United States and they claim that they are a refugee. That means the whole processing for their recognition as a refugee happens when they're in the United States. And in the US, we use the courts to do that. So there's a whole structure of immigration courts that emerged from the 1980 Refugee Act. This system of processing claims really comes from the 1980 Refugee Act. And so, as a professor of rhetoric, as a professor of communication, I always think about the way things are framed. When we hear the message that an asylum seeker is doing it wrong by coming to the US and claiming asylum, that's actually the reverse. They are doing it the right way. That is exactly what this structure was intended to allow. So basic kind of idea, inside or outside. That's where this happens, the processing happens. Okay. All right, so to go back to these categories, who is an asylum seeker? Again, the 5 protected categories are race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a social group. So when an asylum seeker arrives at the border or enters the U.S. and begins to fill out that form, the I-589, which is a very complicated form, the big thing in the mind has to be, how is the persecution that I experienced in my home country, how is the persecution that I'm fleeing connected to one of these categories? Now, I imagine you all can think about things that don't fit these categories, but that we might consider to be political persecution, right? Elements, forms of violence that don't fit these categories. This is where it becomes really challenging for asylum seekers to be successfully received in the U.S. I mentioned at the start that I work a lot on gender-based violence asylum claims and sexuality-related asylum claims. And both of those structures don't really fit this, right? They would fit, most of the time they fit in the membership in a social group. And individuals that have to make their claim through that category have an extra rhetorical burden, an extra burden to bear, because they first have to define what their social group is in a way that the courts will find persuasive. Early on in the U.S., the court said that gender alone does not count. And they said that more than half a country's population does not count as a social group. Like, that's too broad, that's too big. And so women who experience intimate violence, guerrilla-based sexual violence, I mean, there's so many forms, right? They have to do an extra burden of really articulating what that social group is in a way that if you were just a random person in that home country, you might be seen as that. So the dynamic of particularity and visibility gets really challenging in a lot of cases. Increasingly, we're seeing that these categories are really politicized. I'm happy to talk more about those in the Q&A. And I should also stop. If you have questions along the way, feel free to raise your hand. I'm happy to take the questions as they come up in the talk. All right, Mike. Okay, so I said that the 1980 Refugee Act created a structure for evaluating asylum seekers. It gets even more complicated because there's actually like 3 pathways for asylum seekers to be evaluated. I'd like to break it down into 2 pathways. The pathways are individuals who arrive in the U.S. with another form of visa, with another pathway, who are paroled into the country under a different visa. They're processed as affirmative asylum seekers. So that means that their case will first be an interview with a U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services official. It's not as, like defensive, like that dynamic of you really have to prove yourself. An interview is less so. It's more of a conversation. Individuals who arrive at the U.S. border without a visa, individuals who come into the country without a visa, so in an irregular way, and then apply for asylum, or individuals who have a visa but then it expires, so they've overstayed that, are then in what's known as a defensive asylum process. And these are the individuals that in order to apply, they're basically saying, if I don't get this, you can deport me. So that's number 1. And the process happens with an immigration judge. So immediately the stakes are raised because you really have a judge in a defensive sort of, you must prove this, right? The burden of proof is on you process That makes it much more challenging. The majority of asylum seekers in the US today do not have legal representation. I cannot imagine going through this system without legal representation. And so this becomes a big barrier in being able to successfully make one's case, mostly because it's reliant on this really technocratic expertise language that if you don't know how to base your claim in precedent and to make the right definitions, you are never going to be successful, right? Even someone such as myself who has studied asylum for decades, I can't imagine going through this process on my own. So this is a thing that becomes a challenge. There's no legal right to representation in this context. Okay, Mike. I thought I would give you some of the numbers about what we're seeing lately in terms of like who's applying for asylum, what the rates of asylum are. I think there's a perception right now that the asylum system is mostly folks from Central and South America who are arriving at or within the borders of the U.S. to claim asylum. The statistics actually say something very different, that the asylum system is being used mostly by communities of China, Afghanistan, Turkey, Venezuela, a little bit in the past few years. But historically, it has not been Latin America that has been the source for asylum seekers in the U.S. From 2014 to 2023, so a decade, nearly, I guess, 300,000 people were granted asylum. Chinese were the largest national group who received asylum in the U.S. It was like accounting for 17% of all grants, so a really significant amount. I like to share this just because I think it also helps to shift and help us think about like who is using this as a means of protection. And if we look at the nationalities, we can see like these are places where we know there are contexts of repression, political instability, violence, sometimes conflict. And so you can kind of see those things play out in these numbers. All right, you can go to the next one. Okay, this is to show in terms of asylum grants, asylum denials. So the green is asylum, percentage of asylum that's been granted. The blue is the percentage of asylum that has been denied. What we're seeing in the last year, and it's even gotten worse actually, is that the rate of denial for asylum claims is going down really drastically. It used to kind of hover around 30% approval rate, a rating, 70% denial. Now I think we're at like 19% approval rating. Like it's really, really gone down in significant ways. All right, you can go to the next slide.
Sara, what happens when people are denied? What do they do then?
Yeah, so it depends on where they're at in the process, but let's say they're a defensive asylum seeker, so they had the first claim with an immigration judge. If they're lucky to have a lawyer working on that, hopefully the lawyer would appeal, and the appeal would go to the Board of Immigration Appeals. The Board of Immigration Appeals right now is almost 100% siding with the immigration judge. That could be appealed again. It could go to a federal court of appeals. That's increasingly rare because of the Board of Immigration Appeals. So there's an appeals process. A part of that is because in 1967, the U.S. signed on to a condition of non-refoulement. So that means that we as a country are obligated to see the duration of a claim through, right, until it can really kind of go through the court system. That's been challenged in certain ways, but yeah, that's what's happening right now.
And how long is that appeals process, and they're not allowed to work during that time, right?
Yeah, the appeals process, yeah, that would add years onto it. Currently, the reality is that just applying for asylum means that you're in a many-year wait. I think like the average wait I'm seeing right now is like 4 or 5 years for, and I'll talk about that in a second. I'll give you some numbers. Once you apply for asylum, there is a way to get a work permit. You still have to wait a little bit to get that. Yeah. Yeah.
And what percentage of those people are in detention as opposed to being in the population?
More and more. Unfortunately, more and more. I'll show you where we're at later on, the numbers of folks in detention. It depends. Yeah, it depends. So if it's an affirmative asylum seeker, they're not in detention. If it's a defensive asylum seeker, so somebody who is basically not in regular status, they may be in detention at that point right now. Years later, no, but we're in a different world right now. Yeah. I like questions, so feel free to ask them if they come up. Yeah.
You know how you heard the news, like, blah, blah, so-and-so is going through the process, they go to USCIS.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, I will. And she's still asking me. I'll repeat it.
I can talk louder. You know how in the news you heard, hey, so-and-so went to USCIS by appointment, and boom, all of a sudden this person got detained.
Yeah.
Like, can you give us, like, scenarios on why that happened?
Yeah, that was happening. It's not happening as much right now, but like mid 2025. So the question was in the news. We heard maybe like 6 months ago, a year ago, we heard about individuals who would go to their USCIS appointment, or they would go to immigration court, and they would be arrested by ICE in that moment. The question is, why was that happening? How was that happening? Is it still happening? Right now. So especially the ones where it was the immigration court, many of those individuals were asylum seekers. They were going for their asylum case. What would happen, this is a little like trick that ICE had in relation to the state attorney. The state attorney, so in an asylum hearing, hopefully as an asylum seeker you have a lawyer. But the state also has a lawyer, so the state is there with their lawyer. So the state, in these situations at immigration court, would move to dismiss the case, which sounds like a good thing, right? Like if you're the other attorney, you think, oh, okay, they're going to dismiss this deportation case or this dynamic against my client. So they would move to dismiss, and everyone would sign. And then that effectively made that person they didn't have this dynamic against it, but it made them deportable. So ICE was able to pick them up pick them up immediately and put them in detention. Yeah, and similar things at USCIS office hearings. Yeah, yeah. And so now the immigration lawyers I work with a lot, if there's a risk that might happen with their client, they'll ask if they can do a video conference hearing rather than, so like immigration law it's like you're constantly flexing with whatever the policy is at the moment and whatever the strategies are that immigration and customs enforcement officers are using, DHS is using, and so this is it's just like a constantly changing dynamic of how do you advocate for your client when the rules are constantly changing, right? Yeah, I haven't seen as much of that right now, but that was, like 6 months ago, that was definitely a strategy to pick up more people. Yeah.
Sara, do you have any insights of people that get detained?
Yeah.
What happens exactly?
Yeah, I do have insights because I'm at the Dodge County Jail, which is a detention center, monthly. So maybe we know this in Wisconsin. We do have a detention center. The jail in Dodge County in Juneau is a detention center. There's about 200 beds since I last counted. This is a jail, right? So individuals who are in detention in Dodge are mixed with everyone else who is at the jail at Dodge. A lot of what's happening right now is they don't stay there very often. It's used as sort of a regional staging zone, and then individuals are shipped, moved to other detention facilities closer to, basically closer to the south, where there are flights, like deportation flights that happen. I'll show you some of the statistics about that in a minute, but there's a whole complex system of planes, like airlines and buses that move people who are detained to different places. And a part of that is also strategic, right? The further you are away from your family, the harder it is to stay in contact. The further away you are from your lawyer, the harder it is for that person to fight your deportation. And the quicker the process moves, the faster you're out of the US, and then it's almost impossible to fight a deportation. If you're a lawyer in Mexico, you can't represent, you don't have a US license to represent someone. If you're a lawyer in Colombia, you can't represent someone. And so those are dynamics that become really, really challenging. And yeah, at first, during the 2025, January 2025, we didn't see too much of a augmentation of detention and deportation, but now we do. Right now, we're almost double what we were in detention from last year at this time, really a significant amount. All right, I'm gonna have you, I can see if this clicker is working now too. Oh, I got a good helper over there. So these are asylum applications in the last few years, and I show this only to demonstrate that it is true that post-2021, there was a rise in asylum applications. So you can see they stayed pretty much, under 300,000 per year through 2021, and then there was a really significant increase 2023, 2024, 2025. And so the messaging that there are more people applying for asylum is true. That was true in those last 3 years. But I also think it's helpful to recognize that there have been less and less other options for people to remain in the United States. So as other visas, other permits, various mechanisms get harder and harder, there are less openings of other options, asylum kind of becomes people's only option. And so yeah, that was true. Oh, this is working now. I don't know, it's magic. It's just magic, that's it. This is to show, so we saw the last few years asylum applications going up. This is a graph that shows the number of immigration judges we've had of the last few years, right? And so you can see, it's true. I'm going to show you the backlog in a second of the cases. It's true that there was, they were hiring more immigration judges through the Biden administration, and then really 2025, you can see there's a significant drop in immigration judges. President Trump fired a bunch of immigration judges who did not decide cases in ways that align with his agenda. Now what we see, there's been a rehiring, but he's rehired back JAG officials, so people who are trained in the military court system. So those folks now serve as immigration judges. That means they have no training in immigration law. I remember I was serving as an expert witness on this case. It was about maybe 6 months ago, maybe 2 months, I can't, a couple of months ago. Anyway, the attorney said, yeah, we have a judge who's been in this position 6 days. They immediately moved over from the JAG system. Know nothing about asylum and immigration. All of this means that there's currently almost a 4 million case backlog in cases that are awaiting, a really significant amount. This means that even after you apply for asylum, you may be waiting years and years and years and years. And for immigration advocates, in some ways, we think that's not so much of a bad thing, because currently all cases are really denied. Like it's hard to win an asylum case at this point. Yeah.
When Trump fired all those judges,
Yeah.
was there a lawsuit against them then to try to stop him?
No, not that. I mean, there's been so many other lawsuits, but not that I know of. I'll look. I don't think so. But it's a good point. Yeah. All of this is also connected to what I think of as a narrowing of asylum protections in general. So if we think about asylum beginning with the 1980 Refugee Act until now, even prior to the current administration, there have been ways that asylum as a protection has been narrowed. So in 1996, President Clinton implemented a one-year rule. This meant that to apply for asylum, you had to do so within 1 year of coming to the US, which presumes a lot of knowledge, right? Like, I think about how old I was when I learned that asylum was a thing, right? Like, I was pretty much an adult, right? So it presumes a lot of knowledge about these protections that are available. In 2018, the Attorney General at the time said, if you're fleeing gang-related violence, if you're fleeing domestic violence, that doesn't count. So using precedent to narrow those frameworks. That's been challenged a little bit, but those are really still hard cases to demonstrate. And then most recently, in 2023, Biden prohibited people who enter the U.S. without inspection. So these are individuals who came to the U.S.-Mexico border, entered not at an official port with an appointment, but entered the U.S. like people enter the U.S. irregularly. So that point made these individuals ineligible for applying for asylum. This is what was talked about as the asylum ban, the transit ban, basically saying that there are right ways and wrong ways to arrive at or within the borders of the U.S. to claim asylum. This is still in effect today. This is something that's still in existence.
If you enter on a tourist visa and then stay longer,
then you entered with inspection, so you would still be eligible. But you would have to do it within 1 year of arriving in the U.S.
okay.
So the 1 year rule still exists. Yeah. Yeah.
But so, from what you said before, it sounds like the people that came in, how Biden wanted people to come in to claim asylum, now you can no longer do that.
In a lot of ways, yeah. So Biden had implemented, I don't know if you'll remember this conversation, Biden said you should not enter without inspection. You need to use a process that's called Customs and Border Protection 1. It was an application that people had on their phones, so they had to basically wait in Mexico in shelters. I worked in a lot of those shelters, so I remember seeing this dynamic. Wait in shelters until they received their appointment. Individuals were waiting like half a year more for basically like a lottery system for that appointment to come. But they were effective. So they did enter through Customs and Border Protection. So those individuals would still be eligible to apply for asylum. But not anymore, right? Think of, like, if they entered in 2024, we're now in 2026, right? So the 1 year rule.
Why are they not doing the hearing? Is it because they're too backed up?
What hearing?
What is the reason why the people who said they want to seek asylum haven't had their hearings?
They're backed up. It's the backlog.
But they have this law that they have only a year.
Oh, they have a year to apply.
Okay.
So they send in their application, and then they have to wait for the notification, like your appointment with the judge is on this date.
From what I understand, they can't work
Yeah.
during that.
Yeah, depending on how they entered. I mean, and this is a part of the complication. So, for example, if someone entered through CBP 1 and they had a way to apply for humanitarian parole or temporary protected status. There's some other statuses. So they may have received that status, and on that basis they could work. But every person's situation is a little different. This is where, like, the nuances really matter. But there are some situations where, that means they could not work. Yeah.
So those 4 million people that are waiting, does that include all of these people in detention centers?
It's some of them, yeah. Yeah, some of them. There are people in detention centers that have not applied for asylum either, right? Like, there's
If they were
any
stolen off the street.
Yeah, any number of situations. But yeah, there are definitely people in detention centers who are a part of this. They apply for asylum, some dynamic happened, and now they are being detained. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question which may be a little bit off-center, but it's something I couldn't get out of my mind since reading about it sometime last year.
Okay.
In Honduras, which I guess is sort of a dictatorship, the president of that country started stripping anybody of their citizenship who spoke out against it.
Yeah.
So they're stateless.
Yep.
They're not Honduran citizens either, and I think they've been ordered to leave the country. Number one, what happens to those who are ordered to leave the country who don't or can't leave the country because they have nowhere to go? I'm not sure if I want to know what happens to them, but it sounds like a scary situation.
Yeah.
Is there any provision in immigration law, even before the current administration in the United States, that makes allowances for people in that situation?
I mean, the context of a stateless person, this is the protection I'm describing right now would be the protection to seek. Yeah, asylum would be the mechanism. Exactly. In the context of Hondurans, we're also seeing many individuals leaving the country and applying for asylum in Mexico. So Mexico has really been a bright spot in thinking about the reception of refugees around the world. They have a 70% acceptance rate of people who apply for asylum. So that's another talk. That's a talk for another day. But that has been a place. There are problems with the system, but I think also it's helpful to see where there are successful models. Mexico, Brazil are successful models in the region that we should be looking to and holding up. Yeah. Okay, I have so many questions about what's happening since 2025, so I thought I would end by talking a little bit about what's happened since 2025. So prior to 2025, I started a few years before that a project called the Migration in the Americas Project. This was a project that focused a lot of energies in Colombia and Mexico, making sure that individuals in migration had access to good information about their options for movement and their options for seeking viable residence somewhere. So we worked a lot in Colombia with individuals who were considering movement through the Darien Gap, that really awful jungle stretch of Panama. So we worked in that area a lot. And then we also worked a lot in Mexico in the shelters. So individuals who had a CBP-1 appointment, they had questions about what happens when I finally have my day with the CBP official? Like, how do I prepare? What do I need to expect? So our project was focused in both of those contexts. 2025 happened, the election in the US happened, and that kind of changed overnight. This is just from March 2025, but almost on day one, there were over 30 immigration-related executive actions that Trump put into place. Now, we know some of these have not come to fruition. They've been challenged in the courts, but the tactic of flood the gates and overwhelm us absolutely happened in dynamics of immigration. This strategy, and this was a document that Trump released in September of 2025, the agenda for asylum and refugees really meant that a flipping of the script. So whereas I started the talk with the idea that every individual has the right to seek asylum, Trump's discourse here is that every nation has the right to control its borders. And so much of what we've seen since then, right, is a set of policies that align with this agenda of really enforcing nations' rights, so nation states' rights rather than individuals' rights. I think we're really in this clash of nation states versus individuals, and the immigration becomes the lightning rod for so much of that contestation. I like to just, as somebody, again, who thinks about how we talk about things, this framework, I think we start to see it play out in nuanced ways. But what it has meant on a policy level, on a day-by-day, practical level, is that more restrictive policies, methods of deterrence have been put into place. We've seen the cutting of humanitarian support, and we've seen even more expansion of militarization. So in terms of enhanced vetting, I don't know what everyone's personal background and experiences and friend and family network are, but probably if you have people in your life who have applied for a tourist visa in the last little year, or a student visa, or have just been an immigrant going through our airports, they've probably experienced some dynamic of this enhanced vetting. Some of this has meant using AI for screening applicants for visas. It means that now if you're applying for a US visa, you have to make sure all of your social medias are open. They have to be in public, open status so that the officials can do their vetting. It's also meant that Customs and Border Protection agents can check any digital devices. A lot of this enhanced screening, and it's also meant more delays, right? So last August, September, as somebody who teaches, I have a lot of international students. I had so many international students who could not arrive because their visa wasn't processed in time. This was a part of some of this enhanced vetting. We've also seen the detained population rise significantly, and actually it's more. So this was September of 2025. Now we're at about 70,000 people who are detained in US detention centers. If you think about where we were in 2024, we kind of hovered around 40,000. So we've almost doubled in detention in just a year. Really, really significant. A lot of what that's meant is a need to create more detention centers, and so we've seen across the United States the expansion of these really fastly constructed detention centers. The one in Florida, I don't know how to do the highlighter thing, Alligator Alcatraz, that got a lot of attention. There's basically the one in outside of El Paso is basically semi-trucks that are just lined up, detention centers. Also in the Midwest, we've seen a rise in detention centers, but this is a part of the expansion of that infrastructure. We've also seen an increase in deportation flights. So at first, the first few months after Trump took office, there wasn't much of a change, but now we're starting to see a pretty significant rise. I think what's important about this graph is actually the gray. So the gray are flights where people are moved from one facility in the US to another. So they're inter-country flights. These aren't detention flights, they're inter-country flights. And we think of this as sort of a staging. So a part of what it means to deport someone quicker is getting them to a place where they can be deported. So a lot of this means moving to the detention facilities in Louisiana and Texas, where deportation flights are happening more frequently. And then, of course, and this I need to get more an updated graph, but we are also seeing increased detention flights. detention flights go around the world, so you'll see them, like everywhere. They're really centered a lot in Central America right now, but it kind of changes on any given day. Tom Cartwright has this organization, Witness at the Border. Tom is a retired financial analyst who realized, wow, my skills as a financial analyst are really useful in tracking deportation flights. And so you can find his data at witnessattheborder.org if you're interested.
Are a lot of those staging flights being using commercial airlines as well? Like from...
Yes and no. So it is a commercial airline, but it's not one that we take, right? So it's more of a like specialized commercial airline. Yeah. And there are military flights that will be used for deportation. They're using military flights less because they're really expensive, and so some of it is about expense. The cost per flight is pretty significant. We're talking about several thousand per person on that flight. If a flight has 200 people, 300 people on it, you can imagine what it's costing to send that flight somewhere.
Wait.
Yeah. No, go ahead. We are. Oh, you just queued me up. So the One Big Better Bill, I can never say that right, but this legislation from last summer is funding a lot of this right now, and it's also funding the expansion of immigration and customs enforcement. So the raids we saw in Minneapolis, in Chicago, and some of our urban centers, this is funding that. I mean, this is an astronomical amount of money being really focused on immigration, enforcement, and militarization. Just like mind-boggling amounts of money. Yeah. We're also seeing, so that's all like the visa and the monitoring what's happening within the border. We're also seeing a narrowing of who can be a refugee, who has access to refugee resettlement and asylum. So first of all, the refugee resettlement program, so the other aspect that I didn't talk about today, it's basically been cut, right? Like, Trump said there will only be 7,500 individuals resettled in 2025, or 2026. The year before that, it was 125,000, right? Like that means like there's really no more system. And the majority were white South Africans that were resettled through that system. I think for 2027, it's going to be something really similar. This effectively means that refugee resettlement as we know it no longer exists. That funding and the numbers supported mostly faith-based organizations that were in the service of doing refugee resettlement. And so that means that those organizations that are so valuable to our communities will not have that funding anymore. That's pretty much cut. And then the other thing, this is like the latest like twisted, I don't even know what to call it, just like twisted dynamic is that we're seeing increasingly the externalization of asylum. So what would be U.S. asylum is now happening by proxy in other countries. So some of this is safe third country agreements. The U.S. now has agreement with countries in Africa, countries in Latin America to accept people who are deported. So that's one aspect. But they're also accepting people who would otherwise apply for asylum in the U.S. So that becomes another dynamic, one that increasingly I'm having to work on as an expert witness. Yeah.
So it seems like there's a huge opportunity for other countries who would like the enrichment of immigrants to come into their country. Could some of this, like, how can we help that happen rather than?
Yeah.
There's a lot of negativity. It's just like.
I know it's hard. I know. It could. I think the idea that you're proposing is a really good one. The current iteration of the safe country agreements is not that. So, for example, the U.S. has a safe country agreement with Honduras, the place that, yeah. So right now, a lot of Latin America, people from Latin America who would be applying for asylum are being moved to Honduras to apply for asylum. Like that's the sort of dynamic that's kind of at work. It could though. It's an interesting proposition.
There should be an international organization.
Yeah, kind of at work. Yeah, at work at that. The unfortunate part is that there really is. I mean, the funding was eviscerated for humanitarian organizations or any of the organizations at an international level that work on these things. They really just were stripped of a lot of funding, and so the last year has been addressing these sorts of challenges, but also trying to figure out a new infrastructure of funding so innovative ideas like that could get some traction, which I think it's important.
Am I correct in believing that the U.S. has cut its funding
Yeah,
to those
yeah.
international organizations?
Yeah.
We don't-
Yeah, I mean, USAID funded, so like the humanitarian organizations I worked with in Colombia mostly received funding from USAID. They know, I mean, everyone lost their jobs.
And we are not contributing to the UN anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, those two elements, exactly right. Yeah.
Well, in one of those first slides, it showed that like the greatest number of refugees was from Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking Latin American versus people who've been, who are trying to settle here, who have been at war.
Yeah.
What's happening with the Afghani refugees?
So that graph was the grants. So who's received, who's won an asylum case in the U.S. So Afghanis did receive asylum in the U.S. They also struggle to get at or within the borders of the U.S. to claim asylum. In the work that I did in the Darien Gap region, I saw so many communities from Afghanistan. Latin America became really a route for the world's refugees to arrive at or within the borders of the U.S. to claim for asylum. So I think the Afghan community struggles just as much, right? Because when programs like refugee resettlement that allow for a claim to be evaluated outside of the country, but also still have a viable means of arriving in the U.S., that program is gone. Like, that does not exist anymore. So without those, there's really less and less options. And I think it's also important to keep in mind, like, in the whole scheme of things, the U.S. is not a large receiver country for refugees. A few years back, I looked at the statistics, and in the U.S. there is 0.8 refugee for every 100,000 people in the U.S. Less than one person per 100,000 people. Whereas Lebanon, the number at that point was like 200 people per 100,000. Sweden, 8 people per 100,000. So, like, in the scheme, like, we haven't actually been that much of a receptor country, but the messaging, right, the political discourse would have us believe something very different. Yeah.
On that note of the messaging, is there then this insidious grain of truth that there's a crisis at the border because it was created so that everybody has to go through Mexico because they can't get in anywhere else? So now Afghans are coming through Mexico and Latin America. In other words, there's always, in the messaging and in the propaganda, there's always like this thread of truth. Is that, I mean, in other words, did we create the crisis of the border?
So what I would say is that's not true anymore, right? There are more people leaving the U.S. than arriving in the U.S. We now, in the migration community, we talk about el flujo de inverso, like there's more migration south than there is migration to the United States. What you say, though, I think is important. There's a piece of this that I think is really significant. So it is true that the the Biden administration did create a few programs. So the Office of Safe Mobility was one, where the idea was to create a system where it wouldn't be necessary to take such dangerous pathways through the desert of, along the U.S.-Mexico border, and also the Darien Gap. Those programs just didn't have enough time to get off the ground. I mean, they were in operation for a year. Like that's not enough time to get off the ground. It is true also that the creation of the offices, the CBP-1 app, the intention was to regulate movement, so to kind of keep track of who was arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border. It also meant that there was a bottleneck in the northern part of Mexico. I don't think as somebody who analyzes these questions deeply that the policies created that. I do think that the messaging though created that. There was quite a sense that, and we heard all over the place, that there's a crisis at the U.S.-Mexico. They're letting everyone in. There's a crisis at the Mexico border. That didn't bear out in the policy though. But it's hard if you're not spending your a regular portion of your day, of your week, really thinking about these things deeply. It's hard to see it other than the way it's presented for you, right? And so I also get that disconnect between what we hear and what the reality is.
It seems from some things that I've read that a lot of this is just a major distraction in order to militarize it.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. Yeah. Yeah, and also if you think about like viable, I also think about the way in which the programs that are in place, that are regular pathways of immigration, they've also just become harder, the longer it takes, even if you're, sponsoring a family member, right? That process is gonna take longer, it's gonna be more expensive. So we've just made all of these processes harder. I think that's a part of the conversation as well. We should be thinking about reform, immigration reform. I mean, the country does need immigration reform in a significant way, in a way that would not just create a few pathways, but create options for people to move and to seek residence. Yeah.
Yeah, on that note, dysfunctional politics aside, was there something, in your view, constructive about the immigration reform package before Congress, before the 24 election?
No, I mean, it was just politics. Yeah, we haven't seen a viable one, and I don't even know if we've seen one in my lifetime, right? Like one that really, really is not just about militarization. So much of what we've seen in the last cycles where there's been something before Congress has been just focused on militarization and restriction. It's hard. I don't know what to do in a dynamic where the issue is so politicized that I don't know if we're going to see meaningful options come across anytime soon, unless there's a significant people power pressure, right? I think that was the end. Yeah, that was the end of my talk. That's all I got for you. Thank you all. I'm happy to take more questions. Yep.
You showed us that slide of Trump reframing the principles of immigration. And I was thinking back to Article 13, 14 of the 1948 Declaration. I mean, in light of that new reframing, do you feel like the United States can actually still claim that we're abiding by those two articles? It seems like we've just kind of like thrown them away.
Yeah, we are no longer faithful implementers of those. Yeah, I think that didn't just happen with that. We've strayed from the UNHCR a while ago on matter of immigration. And that has been challenged in court. There are some important legal challenges. There's an organization, El Otro Lado, that I work with they're in Tijuana, they're in San Diego, kind of binational organization. And they had a case before the Supreme Court this week challenging some of these, especially the making people wait at the US-Mexico border, because that really challenges the 1967 Protocol on Non-Refoulement. So we'll see what happens with that case. I don't have super high hopes, but I also think in matter of law and politics, it's also symbolically important that those cases are coming before the Supreme Court. Yeah.
First of all, thank you so
Yeah,
much.
yeah.
And this is just a plug that I've given before, but as you say, it makes a huge difference whether you have legal representation.
Yeah.
And so the plug is for the Community Intervention Law Center.
Oh, I was going to plug them as well. They're so good.
So
Set me up.
we've given money as a church community, but individuals, and I just would strong, because the more money they have, the more legal representation they can offer.
And I endorse that organization wholeheartedly. It's one that I work with, both as an expert witness, but I also send my students there. So I have this class with Latin American Studies. So I have bilingual students that do interpretation services alongside the attorneys. They learn a lot about what it means to interpret in these contexts. They also learn a lot about immigration processes today, and that organization is just doing fantastic things. Voces de la Frontera is also doing really great things in our community, specifically around Know Your Rights, making sure that there is a trusted ICE hotline watch. So those are two that I work with. There's other organizations, but these are the two that I work with a bunch. Yeah.
With these, I was just wondering, for people who maybe don't have a lot of financial resources, is there any other way is there like something we could do to volunteer, to, just, what can, a person do that's not just giving money if they don't have the money to give?
So both of these organizations have volunteer opportunities. So, like if you know how to fill out a PDF, right? Like fill out forms, like so much of immigration support is filling out documents and making sure you're getting the information right. So if you have a computer and can type things into a database, you can be of assistance to both of those organizations. I know that Voces is always looking for someone to keep an ear on their hotline, so that's something that you can do. Both, and if you go to their websites, there's places on both that are like, to volunteer, and they'll give you a list of options. I also work with at UW-Madison at the law school. There's a legal clinic that's also one of the pro bono law clinics in town, the Immigrant Justice Center. So that's another way. They work hand in hand with Silk, so I would say go to Silk first if you're interested. Yeah?
Just another part to answering that there. On Earth Day, we'll have a couple of letter writing opportunities to people from our immigrant support team here at the MCC who couldn't be here today. David Mckinnon wrote a letter to the House of Representatives in support of farm worker visas. That seems like a really simple thing to take care of and really necessary. It's got some bipartisan backing right now. And then Rachel Gilbertson picked up on one for the Dreamers. Rachel works at Middleton High School, and so thinking about young people is really important to her, and ways to move forward with hopefully something that would be a little bit more stable safety for the Dreamers.
That's great. Really important work. Yeah. Oh, I'm going to go here and then go there, because I see you out of the corner of my eye.
With the work that you do every day, how do you get up in the morning? I mean, I just find it's heartbreaking.
Yeah. I get up because it's important, right? Like,
yes.
Yeah. And then we all have ways of like taking care of our hearts. So making sure you're implementing those things, but get up in the morning and do the work, I think is it, right? Like there is significant. The need is significant. I've never found that to be like it's never stopped me. I know it's hard. It can be challenging. But with the students that I work with, we also talk about trauma-informed social justice work, this sort of work, because it is important to think about, like, how do you care for your heart? So yeah, try to follow those principles. Yeah.
I was just